Yesterday, the Mercedes Formula 1 team and James Allison produced and released a video explaining some of the challenges that the halo, has thrown up for the teams in Formula 1 heading into 2018. And I thought it was a great video. If you didn't see it, I will put a link in the description to that video so you can go and watch it. But it did raise a number of quite interesting questions, I thought, that probably deserve a little bit more explanation. The first, I think, of the questions that it's raised, and something that lots of people on social media were quick to point out: why on earth is it Mercedes that are having to do the sort of PR, if you like, for Formula 1 in terms of explaining why we're having to run a halo? You know, what the challenges are in using it, how it's going to work, what it weighs, what it costs, how difficult it is to install. All of these things should be being done by Formula 1 in a kind of positive PR spin for this device that most Formula 1 fans don't really want to see on the cars. So just why is it so difficult for a team to incorporate this halo into their chassis design? Well, it has to take huge loads. There are obviously the weight differences and the weight challenges that it throws up, and I'll get into that in a little while. But the loading that this thing has to take and the testing that it has to pass via the FIA to be allowed to be used in the championship this year is pretty extreme. James Allison compared it to putting the weight of a double-decker London bus on the top of this 7-kilo titanium ring without the chassis deforming in any way. Now, that's a lot, and to put it into some kind of context, one of the other really high loading areas on a Formula 1 chassis, particularly from a safety point of view, is the rollover hoop that sits just behind the driver's head. Now, that of course is there to protect the driver if the car were to roll over and land upside down. And to give you some context, the loading figures that it has to pass in that area, 96 kilonewtons worth of force in a downward trajectory. The halo in the same downward trajectory has to take 116 kilonewtons of force. That's a huge increase, and that's a huge amount of load. And to do that, the team will need to completely change the way that the chassis is formed, the way that the carbon fibre is laid up and bonded together. And of course it also will add huge weight. You can't just incorporate those forces with the chassis the way it was, because they're always trying to make these things as light as they possibly can and just about get away with the loads that they need to pass, or the tests that they need to pass. Now these tests have become far more stringent. There's a huge amount of importance in making sure that the chassis in the areas where the halo is mounted can take incredible forces in that. And it's not just in a downward trajectory, that's the one I just mentioned. There are also tests, lateral loads and diagonal loads as well. And the weight, of course, is another issue, because the regulations have changed to accommodate the halo. So the minimum weight of the car has been raised this year by 6 kilos, but the halo weighs more than that. The actual halo itself, the titanium part of the halo, weighs around 7 kilos. Once you add in the brackets and all the fixings for that, you're upwards of 10 kilos for most cars, most teams, and yet the regulations have only allowed an extra 6. So that means they've got to desperately try and save weight in other areas to avoid the car being too heavy and still give them the possibility of putting ballast into the areas that they really want. Don't forget, that is 10 kilos of weight that's really quite high up in the car. That's like an engineer's worst nightmare. The comments that I saw on Twitter yesterday after this video was released highlighted something else, that it seems to me like lots of people just weren't aware that the teams are allowed within the regulations to put some kind of fairing over and around the edge of the halo this year. And that seems to have surprised a lot of people. And that in itself says that, you know, Formula 1 should have been doing a better job of explaining to people what these things are going to look like, what they can do, how they're allowed to be fitted, how they can be modified. The fairing is a very tightly restricted area, so this is something that teams can have some control over in just applying a little fairing to change the aerodynamic wake coming off this halo, because of course, particularly for the air intake, but also for things further back like the rear wing and the rear bodywork, the halo is an absolute disaster. It's not aerodynamically efficient in any way, And for that air intake just above the driver's head, of course, all of that air that they need a really clean line of airflow going straight into that, it's being horribly disrupted. So the teams can fit a fairing, but what James Allison didn't quite explain yesterday is that that's a very tight restriction. The teams have got something in the region of 20 millimeters of area around that frontal pass of the halo to apply a fairing. So it's not very much. So we're not going to see the whole thing being shrouded, changing the view or the way this thing looks tremendously so. What you will get is these little fairings. We saw some of them popping up in the post Abu Dhabi test on the McLaren, on the Toro Rosso, and those things will just help to really control the airflow coming off that halo and direct it into those crucial areas like the engine air intake and the rear wing of the car. What on earth have you found, Wilson? Wilson, come here. What have you got? Oh my goodness. That looks so wrong on so many different levels. Wilson, go and put it in the bin. Go and put it in the bin. Now we know that the Halo was tried and tested by a number of different drivers on a number of different cars and at a number of different circuits over the course of the last couple of years now. What hasn't yet been tested, because it just simply we haven't been able to do so, is to have every car lined up on a starting grid, all fitted with the halos of course, and just see what impact it has on the driver's field of vision and particularly their view of the start lights. Somebody raised this as a question on in the comments to one of my earlier videos, and it's a good point. You know, the reality is some drivers or some grid slots will have their vision of those start lights impaired, but of course the FIA and the circuits will not just allow that to be the case, so they're already now looking at ways to make sure that it doesn't have a negative impact, and that could be from either moving the start lights from their current position or having multiple sets of start lights, so that every single driver in every single grid slot can see them at the start of the race, which is obviously reasonably important. I remember years and years ago when I first started out in racing, I was racing or working with a Caterham 7 race, and there must have been 40 cars. It's a huge grid. We were at Spa, and in the old days the start line at Spa was down the hill going down towards Eau Rouge, and the grid was so enormous that the actual grid went around the corner at the top of the hill, and so if you were towards the back of the grid you couldn't see the start lights because they were off around the corner. And back in those days, to get over that situation, we had a guy from the team who went and positioned himself in the grandstand at the top of the hill with a brightly coloured umbrella, and as the start lights went green or went out, he would raise his umbrella, and our driver would have been told to go and, you know, to watch this guy in the grandstands, and the umbrella being opened was his key or his signal to start the race, when everyone else was kind of waiting to react to what the other drivers were doing. I seem to remember it gained us a good few places off the start back then, but in Formula 1 can't see that cutting it. Now I know nobody likes the look of the Halo, me included, but one of the things that really came out of Mercedes' video yesterday was that you know, this is the first iteration that will be raced in Formula 1, the first iteration of the Halo, and like everything in Formula 1, it will be under constant review, constant development. There will be people working away in the background, even though the teams can't develop it themselves through the course of a season. There'll be people working away in the background to try and make this thing much more aesthetically pleasing than it currently is. Don't forget, it was the teams that came up with this idea. I think the actual Halo system was proposed by Mercedes originally a few years ago, after the FIA had already done, you know, lots and lots of crash testing, collecting their own data on how it might impact the sport, how it might save lives. But it was the teams who actually came up with this kind of concept, and it will be the teams who find ways to make this more aesthetically pleasing, more aerodynamically beneficial to them, whilst of course keeping the overall point of it, which is the safety of the drivers. Come on, Wilson. Wilson, this way. Now, like everything, in Formula 1, it will split opinion, already has split opinion. I've seen some people say that they won't be watching Formula 1 in 2018 because of the halo. They hate it that much. I mean, that seems like an extreme view to me, but that's the view that some people have. I've seen other people say that, you know, 3 or 4 races in, I'm sure we won't even be talking about it anymore. And I think that's pretty much where I sit. If you think back to the whole shark fins and T-wings debate at the beginning of last year, where it was probably the biggest talking point for quite a while as to how ugly these things looked. 3 or 4 races in, we weren't really talking about them anymore because we had a great championship battle on our hands between Sebastian Vettel and Lewis Hamilton. That's what I think, and that's what I hope will happen in 2018, that the racing will be the talking point and the halo will fade into insignificance. But I want to know, as ever, what you think. Can you get over it? Can you put it to the back of your mind? Or is it going to be the thing that jumps out at you when you turn your TV set on to watch 2018's Formula 1 season? Let me know what you think. What would you do? How would you do it differently? What would you like to see on the cars to keep the drivers safe? Or would you not have anything? Let me know in the comments below. Like the video, if you have liked it, please. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Share it around with your mates, please. I'd really appreciate it. And I will see you next time.